Сталин хороший, распад СССР катастрофа, а Украины никогда не было.
Современная Украина целиком и полностью была создана Россией.
It sounds like nonsense, but may soon become historical truth, at least for Russian school children. The gold standard of school books will soon appear in Russia. Now, in different schools, different books can be used. Then, according to the new rules, this will not be possible anymore. The Russian State Duma is currently working on this law. Officials decided that different opinions in textbooks are unacceptable, and it was urgent to give identical textbooks to all school children. This is especially important in case of history. The multiplication table or the periodic table cannot be changed that easily, even by Russian officials, but history is a flexible subject. Some historical facts can be a subject to alternative interpretation, others can be forgotten, and some, on the contrary, highlighted. Ideological work with the teaching of history has been going on in Russia for many years, because this is a great way to influence the minds of children. With the help of new textbooks, they can learn, for example, about the greatness of Stalin, about the nightmares of the 90s, or about the fact that Ukraine never existed. Today we will talk about how history is taught in Russian schools, how ideology affects education, and which consequences introduction of a single standard of textbooks will have. Winston Churchill once called Russia a country with an unpredictable past. At least now this phrase is attributed to him. This expression perfectly reflects how history can suddenly change in our country. For example, centuries-old empire building suddenly turns out to be an oppression of the worker-peasant class, and democratic reforms become the collapse of the state. In this case, school textbooks record changes in our collective past and begin to cover events differently.
Textbooks of 2000s and 2020s, of course, are very different textbooks because, firstly, the last period of Russian history was included only in the most recent textbooks. On the other hand, of course, the idea of which events and to which extent to include is also changing. For example, they began to pay a little more attention to the history of everyday routine, and they include it in project activities and textbooks. Of course, some interpretations of events also change. Some topics are given more attention. For example, Ukraine is given more attention in modern textbooks. Some difficult questions are raised, and in general more attention is paid to the Pereslavl Rada of the 17th century, to the events of the 20th century, to the fate of the Crimea, for example. Sometimes it's a matter of terms that are used, for example, concerning the beginning of World War II. What terms were used then? Annexation or reunification with some other lands. Of course, there is such a rewriting, a change in interpretations all the time. Another thing is how much attention is paid and how carefully what is happening is described. And here, of course, we see that some events are beginning to be given a little less attention. And of course, again, the question of interpretations arise. Yes, interpretations are starting to change. For example, it's true about the story of massive deportations of people, whole nations that were evicted mainly during the Second World War, and then were returned during the Khrushchev era. Information has disappeared about how many people were deported, or in what conditions they were in the special settlements, or what happened next with these national entities.
Of course, no one has yet turned a history textbook into a fiction. Any significant events find their place there. Another question is that it is possible to mention an event in different ways. For example, we know that recently it has been legally prohibited to discuss various aspects of the Second World War. Other topics have not yet been affected by such a ban. But it is clear that Stalin's repressions, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the reforms of the 90s can be described in completely different ways. Stalin can be called, for example, a modernizer of the country, and the collapse of the USSR was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe.
In recent years, the version of history has not changed much. What people have been doing in recent years was an attempt to add there as many judgments of very recent events as possible. Basically, criticism of textbooks and some changes and announcements about the development of new books or additions to the old books were connected with this. And so there is a gradual strengthening of the topic of so-called Russian державность, which means great powerness. In general, several theses in textbooks are clearly pushed through. We have a special path. The state is always right, and our victory in the Second World War overshadows everything else. There were a few mistakes, but in general, our history is glorious. From this, the conclusion follows that a great future awaits us. For example, in the history textbooks, descriptions of so-called perestroika are more and more emphasizing that it was a hasty and overly traumatic for a large part of the people period, which is in general correct. I can agree with this. Also, I remember the years of perestroika as the happiest years of my life, but I perfectly understand how difficult life was. Another thing is that, well, it's difficult, but happiness is not necessarily connected with an easy life. But it's a fact that today perestroika and the period of the 90s are an extremely important period in ideological terms, because those are used as a justification of everything that was happening in 2000s and 2010s. This is an absolute absurdity, but today, almost 25 years after Yeltsin, he is still, along with Gorbachev, blamed for all the fails and problems. And most people are fine with that because it's a simple and comfortable version for them.
Now, Russian authorities want to include war in Ukraine in the history books. Naturally, no one will call it a war. It seems more likely that school children will be taught how the president announced a historic special operation to protect the Russian-speaking people from Nazi agents of the West. Now, the annexation of the Crimea to Russia and the recognition of the independence of the DPR and LPR have already been included in the school course of modern history. I think I do not have to explain you how these events are interpreted in these textbooks.
Of course, the question arises about Ukraine and how recent events are shown or will be reflected in history books. It will be something like that. There was some kind of Ukrainian state, then the Nazis got power, and the events of 2014 took place. It's like about the same thing as in 1939 there was in Poland, when in fact there was no state. Well, at least it was told like that. And we had people who could get hurt, and we had to protect them. Therefore, they want to join us, and we're getting new territories, which in general historically were ours anyway. But in general, the attitude, and not only with Ukraine, it's that 30 years of independence of these 15 post-Soviet states are some kind of a historical mistake. There was a Soviet state, and accordingly, now all the peoples are the Soviet people. That is not even brother people, which is quite an unscientific term, but is widely used in Russia. But it's just one people, one blood, one religion, one language. Naturally, we must be together. Of course, now they want to show the events of 2022 in Russian textbooks. And most likely it will be shown the same way, that there were Nazis and nationalists who, with the help of the West, arrange almost a genocide, and Russia saves civilians.
In general, textbooks are already being prepared for a new version of the history of Ukraine. Their authors have already been working on the so-called de-Ukrainization of history for the last year. As Mediazone wrote, the publishing house Prosveshchenie received a command to remove the mention of Ukraine and Kiev from textbooks as much as possible. For example, Kiev Rus is recommended to be called simply Rus. You can write about the salvation of Kiev from the invaders, but you can't write about the independence of the Kiev state. Even in the story about the baptism of Russia, it is necessary to write that Prince Vladimir did not baptize Kiev, but simply baptized the capital of Rus. In general, when the government begins to change the past for the sake of regime, it doesn't lead to anything good. Now, information about independent Ukraine is being erased from the minds of Russians, apparently in order to make it easier to deprive them of this independence. Propaganda depicts the democratic reforms of the 90s as a time of lawlessness, poverty and anarchy, so that no one wants democratic reforms anymore. And the Stalinist repressions are represented as something maybe bad but necessary. And in general, the thousands of dead people mean nothing when you have an atomic bomb and a victory in the Second World War.